Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back. I'm the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm here to talk to you about the Trinity as a mystery. This is part 3 in my series entitled Testing the Trinity, where I'm looking at the Trinity and testing it out to see whether or not it holds up against criticisms. Now, as a reminder, in the first video of this series, part 1, I explained what the doctrine of the Trinity is, and in part 2, I explained a logical problem that falls out of affirming 7 key premises that Orthodox Trinitarianism is based on. Now, today I will be explaining one of the popular responses that I typically get from Christians, especially lay Christians, in regards to the logical problem of the Trinity that I presented in part 2. So one of the common responses I've gotten thus far is that, look, Jake, the Trinity is just a mystery. Now, we have to understand exactly what this means to see whether or not it makes any sense. Now, typically, the Greek term used in the New Testament for the term mystery simply refers to a truth which in some sense is hidden or unknowable. However, Paul frequently refers to a mystery in the sense that it is something that is hidden that is then revealed and known by man through God's revelation. Okay? Trinitarians usually appeal to 2 key reasons for why the Trinity is ultimately a mystery. The first is that God, in the ultimate sense, is unknowable and beyond human comprehension. And the second is that human intellect is not adequate for acquiescing or understanding what the doctrine actually is, fully being able to grasp the doctrine. So it is an epistemic problem, they say, due to God's nature on the one hand and man's nature on the other hand. It's an in-principle epistemic problem. Now, there, broadly speaking, are 2 types of mysterianism, which are referred to in the literature. I'm not making these terms up. They've been used by people like Dale Tuggy, Dr. Branson, who I've mentioned in the past, and several analytic Christian philosophers. Now, one of these types of mysterianism is negative mysterianism, and we have positive mysterianism on the other hand. I'm first going to go through what the definition and understanding of negative mysterianism is. Now, negative mysterianism is the idea that the Trinity is a mystery, that we cannot speak about the Trinity in a meaningful way due to lack of information that is available to us. So it's not a matter of that we have too much information, it's that we have a lack of information that's available to us. Now these negative Mysterians, I'll call them, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, they would claim that there isn't a contradiction or even an apparent contradiction in the way that I expressed in the previous video. And going forward, guys, as long as you're familiar and comfortable with what's called the logical problem of the Trinity, I will be referring to it in shorthand going forward as the LPT for short. Okay, so these negative Mysterians, okay, they would say that the triune God exists and we are unable to categorize it because it is completely unlike anything in the creative realm, okay? Gregory of Nazianzus seems to hint at this sort of idea in some of his writings, and one example of this can be found in his famous work, the Orations, Oration 31, where I'm going to read a quote for you what St. Gregory states. Okay, so great St. Gregory of Nazianzus states, "So in the end, I resolved that it was best to say goodbye to images and shadows, deceptive and utterly inadequate as they are to express that reality," speaking of the Trinity. "I resolved to keep close to the more truly religious view and rest content with some few words, taking the Spirit as my guide, and in his company and in partnership with him, safeguarding to the end the genuine illumination I had received from him. As I strike out a path through this world, To the best of my powers, I will persuade all men to worship Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the single Godhead and power, because to him belong all glory, honor, and might forever and ever. Amen. So, this is a quote from St. Gregory of Nazianzus, where he's explaining, after going through lengths of different analogies that have been proposed up until that point, about what the Trinity actually is. He ultimately says, look guys, there's no analogy in the created order that adequately represents what the Trinity is, and he basically, in some sense, gives up on the project of doing that. Okay? Now, what is exactly the problem with negative Mysterianism? Why should we think that it isn't a good solution? Or maybe it is. I mean, we have to take a look and see. I am not persuaded by negative Mysterianism for a few reasons. Personally, I hardly ever find a Christian who is a consistent negative Mysterian, in the sense that I just described. Now, what do I mean by that? The negative Mysterian is basically saying from the get-go, no language we use can really be ultimately used to describe the Trinity in a completely accurate sense. So it's not merely that we can use terms and we don't understand them. It's that we're saying from the beginning these ideas of one being, three person, one what, three who's, all of these things ultimately fall short of an analogy or even adequate language being able to be used to describe God and the Trinity specifically. The problem is that I hardly ever, in conversations with Christians, whether academic Christians or lay Christians, I hardly ever find them expressing this consistently and completely sticking to this sort of Mysterianism. What I typically find, however, is Christian Trinitarians, they don't just leave it at a mystery and say, we just believe in the Trinity and leave it at that. They make claims about who God is and try to explain in intelligible sentences what the Trinity is and how we should understand it. We have this taking place in the early creeds of the church by theologians in the past, all the way up until the present day. We are told things like God is one being that exists in three persons, there is one what and three whos, etc. This, to me, does not seem like such an innocent Mysterian approach, now does it? I mean, it doesn't to me. If you guys feel otherwise, you can comment and let me know your thoughts. My thinking is, how can we believe in a set of propositions when we quite literally cannot grasp the meaning of these propositions? I mean, the negative Mysterian even casts doubt on the project of putting these sentences together in some sense. They're worried about even using terms like being and person to refer to God in that sense when they don't feel that Scripture ever really describes the Trinity as three persons. So yeah, they have a quite radical approach to these things. Now, like I said, the problem is that we don't find any Christians really consistently upholding this view in conversation, so there doesn't seem to be practical application, and the creeds just don't seem to reflect this strict notion of a strict negative Mysterianism. Now, what can we say about positive Mysterianism on the other hand? Positive Mysterianism makes the claim that there is not a lack of information about the Trinity, that there's too much information. It is not akin to something that I don't know. It is more something like which seems to be A and not A, which means a contradiction, that you affirm the existence of A and not A simultaneously. Now, there seems to be a contradiction when we describe this being in a set of propositions like I did in part 2 of this series. So the positive Mysterian would agree with those statements. They would have no problem affirming those 7 statements, and they would also agree with me that those 7 statements seem to result in an apparent contradiction. So like I said, the positive Mysterian would agree that the doctrine is an apparent contradiction, but it is merely apparent, not actual. So that's where we would kind of part ways. Now, the problem with this position is that the argument of the LPT, or the logical problem of the Trinity, is attempting to demonstrate that the doctrine is an actual contradiction and not merely an apparent one. So the Trinitarian, including the positive Mysterian, should be motivated at minimum to show that it is merely an apparent contradiction and not an actual one. It doesn't suffice just to make the claim without attempting to demonstrate the claim. So you have to, the positive Mysterian, if you're going to say that it's merely an apparent contradiction and someone is claiming that it's an actual contradiction, you have to show how the 7 propositions don't result in an actual contradiction and they're merely an apparent one. Once you make that claim, you share a burden of proof to show that. Now, as I said, it doesn't suffice to make the claim without attempting to demonstrate the claim. Also, the positive Mysterian should give us a mechanism to distinguish an apparent contradiction from an actual contradiction. Because what they're saying is there's a difference between an apparent contradiction and an actual contradiction, which I have no problem admitting that there is. Sometimes things appear to be a contradiction, and in actuality, when we do further research, they're not an actual contradiction. But we need some kind of mechanism or tool to use that we can distinguish these two categories. We need a mechanism or tool to be able to distinguish from an apparent contradiction in general and an actual contradiction in general on the other hand. And I mean this broadly speaking, not just in application to the Trinity. We need a general tool that we can use, and then we can apply that to the doctrine of the Trinity, in which case then we can, as the positive Mysterian claims, we can distinguish and make that proper distinction between the apparent contradiction on the one hand and an actual contradiction on the other hand. The other problem with this is that it opens the floodgates to using this sort of response to Christian claims against other religious doctrines held by other groups. So what I mean by that is, now when a Christian formulates an argument or makes a set of propositions to claim that another religious group, whether it be another Christian group, a Christian sect, or whether it be a Buddhist or Hindu or a Muslim, etc., when they make a claim and formulate an argument that this is a contradiction, well then that other person can simply respond, well no, hey look, this I agree with you, I believe all these statements, and it looks like a contradiction, but it's just an apparent contradiction, not an actual contradiction. And they're going to push back and say, no, it's an actual contradiction. So what I'm saying, in order to get out of the stalemate problem, the positive Mysterian needs to set up a tool or mechanism by which we can properly distinguish between an actual contradiction and a mere contradiction on the other hand. And unless they're able to do this and then demonstrate how those 7 propositions are just an apparent contradiction and not an actual one, they really haven't done anything to alleviate the problem. Now, Dale Tuggy, who is a popular Christian philosopher, comments on this issue, and he makes sort of the same point that I was making, that this, once you do this, it kind of opens the floodgates to other criticizing other belief systems. Now, he says, and I quote, "Further, many a traditional non-pluralistic Christian must admit that she would wield an apparent contradiction like this as a bludgeon against theories in any other religion such as Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and so on, even against quote-unquote heretical views in or near the Christian camp. Thus, the positive Mysterian, which is the group of people we are talking about, the positive Mysterian seems to be special pleading, claiming as a virtue for her own cherished theory what she would denounce as a deficiency in anyone else's theory." So the point is that once you open the floodgates to say, well, this is just an apparent contradiction and it's not an actual contradiction, well then you have to be consistent with allowing that as a response to claims of contradiction. And I don't think that Trinitarians, generally speaking, do that. So we have to be fair. Once you allow that as a response, you have to allow that response to other groups when you charge them with incoherence and contradictory belief sets. So once again, guys, in summary, I just want to briefly recap what I've said thus far in the video. I explained that the mystery response to the LPT, or the logical problem of the Trinity, is a common one, although not common amongst Christian analytic philosophers. I also explained what a mystery is and how it is distinguished from a contradiction. A mystery is something that we cannot fully comprehend due to lack of information or inability. It is not something akin to affirming the existence of a married bachelor, which is the claim levied against the doctrine of the Trinity. I explained the two types of mysterianism, positive and negative mysterianism, and what the problems associated with each one of them are. Negative mysterianism, I said, amounts to saying that the Trinity is something I know not what, and hardly any Trinitarians hold this position in practical application. Positive mysterianism has the burden of proof of demonstrating that the doctrine of the Trinity is merely an apparent contradiction and not an actual contradiction. And no positive Mysterians have been successful in doing so thus far, is what I'm arguing, and you guys can look at the research and tell me otherwise if you feel that they have. Also, that positive Mysterianism loses high ground for criticizing other belief systems via the same principle of apparent contradictions, because a Hindu, or anyone else for that matter, can give this response when claims of contradiction are aimed at their beliefs. So this is very important, guys. On the one hand, negative Mysterianism fails really to give us anything to work with for being able to understand what we believe in. If you're claiming that you believe in something, we have to have a working definition of what that is. On the other hand, positive Mysterianism, who says we have a problem because of us making actual claims, but look guys, it's just an apparent contradiction, not an actual one. They have to give us a mechanism for showing what that differentiation process is, apply it to the Trinity, show that it is just merely an apparent contradiction, and then they also have to be consistent in allowing other people to do the same thing when they levy charges against other religious systems and beliefs of incoherence. And I don't think up until this point that any positive or negative Mysterians really have been successful in being able to do these things consistently. Also, I do just want to note, this seems to be a response of the lay Christian. Generally speaking, it is not a position held frequently in contemporary Christian analytic philosophy. And also, even in the past, there was a sort of a sense of negative Mysterianism in the early church, where they would say, well, it's just very difficult to express these things. But I think we're beyond that point, because Christianity in the creedal statements and otherwise has gone well beyond just sticking to mystery from the beginning. They make a lot of claims. The 7 propositions that I made in the LPT in part 2 of this series, generally Orthodox Christians have no problem affirming those statements. So once you affirm those statements, you can't really be a negative Mysterian in the ultimate sense. You can only go then to positive Mysterianism and say, yes, Jake, we believe in all these things. It looks like a contradiction, but it really isn't one. But I already explained what the problem associated with positive Mysterianism is. Now, that's it for today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this explanation of the mystery response to the LPT. I hope that you guys can share it with people who may find this interesting and who would be likely to give this response to the LPT, or maybe you've experienced them already doing so. Please share this video with them. Maybe it will be able to shed some light on the issue for them and give them something to think about in the future. In the next video, which is going to be part 4 of this series, I will be explaining the main solutions offered to the LPT in a general fashion, and then in subsequent videos, critiquing these proposed solutions in a more detailed fashion. Now, once again, guys, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share if you enjoyed this video and wish to see more content like it in the future. I would really appreciate it, and it would really help me out. Until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum.